so you will be able to see the recording later. So don't feel like you gotta rush and take notes or anything. I think this is going to be a really fun and exciting webinar. We're joined by a panel of some of our superstar teachers who are going to talk to us about teaching inquiry across the ages. And so we have with us Phil, Jeff, Kathy, and Amy, who will be talking about their experiences using inquiry in the classroom. So before we dive in too deep, I want to go ahead and introduce you to the platform Zoom if you haven't joined one of our webinars before. This is a pretty user-friendly platform, but there are a couple ways that you can make it even better. So when I shared my screen with you, yours probably went full screen. So I like to recommend that you exit full screen. You can do that by going to the options at the top of your screen next to the green bar and hitting exit full screen. Or in some cases, the escape key will do that for you. And that's going to allow you to dock the chat window to the side of your screen, because we're going to have opportunities to communicate and ask each other questions. So I want for everybody to be able to be part of the conversation. So you're going to look for the little speech bubble that should be on the bottom bar of your screen. And click on that, and then it should open a chat window for you on the side of your screen. And then you're going to want to select all panelists and attendees. The default is all panelists, but by selecting all panelists and attendees, we can have a conversation with everyone. So please do remember to do that. So let's go ahead and test out that chat window and let us know where you're from and what type of educator you are. So Jackie, my chat window isn't working. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of reading aloud some of the responses, that would be awesome.
Yeah, welcome. Looks like we have a mix of some informal and formal educators as well as some volunteers. Let's see. We've got someone from Ohio, Dylan, informal educator, a biology teacher, Lisa, science and agricultural teacher from Minnesota. Wow, looks like lots of states are represented tonight. Hi, Sally from Colorado. She's a volunteer helping other educators.
Awesome. Nice to see.
Oh, Rafael from Mexico.
Oh, awesome. Welcome, Rafael. It's nice to see a group of educators from a wide geographic range and different roles with us tonight. Awesome. Thank you, Jackie. So for those of you who haven't attended many of our webinars before, we are from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. We're located in Ithaca, New York, which is not anywhere near as green as this photo right now. Also, there might be like 4 inches of open water in any one spot on the lake. So it is beautiful here, but I'm ready for spring. And I particularly work on the K-12 education team, where our mission is to create innovative resources and trainings that build science skills while inspiring young people to connect to local habitats, explore biodiversity, and engage in citizen science projects. My name is Kelly Schaefer. I'm our outreach coordinator, and I am joined tonight in the chat window by Jackie Kennedy, who is our awesome business and communication specialist. She came in as a pinch hit for me because I only have one hand, so I can't type in the chat window very well right now. So thank you, Jackie, for coming in on the pinch hit. So our K-12 education mission is really achieved in two ways. So we develop curricular resources, so kits and free resources, downloadable activity packets, anything to support educators in their work of getting kids outside and exploring nature. And then we also do suites of trainings around some complex topics like citizen science and inquiry. We have both online and in-person trainings. So we do these webinars once every month throughout the school year. So I think we do them, I think it's 10 months this year we're doing. So we hope to see you at future webinars joining with us. And kind of that two-pronged approach of curricula and trainings, we try to support educators where they are with their different audiences, because you guys are all the ones on the ground, you know, you're doing the work of connecting with students, and we're just trying to do our best to support you in that role. And your relationships with students are so powerful that I think you guys are positioned so well to make a huge impact on students' lives. And so our resources all kind of follow these three pillars. So nature connection, citizen science, and inquiry. And so some resources might focus more on that nature connection piece, just getting outside, using your senses and exploring and building a comfort level in nature and developing kind of a sense of place. So finding a connection to your local habitats. And then we, from there, move kind of towards the science side of the spectrum by incorporating citizen science, which is a way to make your observations part of scientific research. So it's people-powered science. Everyday folks like you and me who aren't professional scientists collecting data, sending that data into databases that are then used by professional scientists to answer real-world questions. So it has that awesome real-world component that can be very motivating for students. And then we move into inquiry, which is the subject of tonight's webinar. If you joined us last week, you got a kind of a brief overview of some of the early stages of inquiry, of asking and answering your own questions in science, which is a really authentic way to experience the science process. And so we'll be diving into that tonight. And from our awesome panelists, we'll be learning how that can look in the classroom and in different educational settings. So the goal of our resources is to change students' conceptions of who and what scientists are. So often when you ask a student to draw a scientist, this is going to be a really common image that you're going to get. A man in a white lab coat with some beakers and some equations. Usually there's crazy hair. In this case, there's a really awesome mustache. And this is kind of the general conception of science that you find when you ask students to draw a scientist. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is one of the things that science can be, but science can also be a lot more, and it can be outside and it can be done by anyone. So we want to start changing that conception of science to include folks like these who are making observations of the natural world and seeking to answer questions about it, all the way to this, to viewing themselves as scientists, as being someone who can think scientifically, and answer questions and make a difference. And I think that's a really powerful experience for a lot of students. Many of you are probably familiar with the STEM gap that exists between genders and how women and non-binary folks are pretty underrepresented in STEM fields, and that gap actually starts at a fairly young age. And it isn't tied to achievement. So girls are still scoring as well or better in science and math subjects, but somewhere along the way, something is happening where they stop viewing themselves as being able to do science or as being the image of what a scientist is. And so by participating in these authentic science experiences, you can kind of break down some of those misconceptions and misbeliefs and build up the sense that anyone can do science, which is something that benefits not just girls, but all students. So inquiry, let's take a moment to kind of find a definition. So inquiry can be really simply stated as asking and answering your own questions in science. So it has that really authentic component. As an educator, it can be a little scary because it means letting go of some control and having things timed out perfectly in your lesson plans. So it can be a little scary when you first start out along the path to inquiry. And that's one of the reasons we think that this panel is going to be great for all of us to discuss and learn from each other about how that can actually go and what it might look like in the classroom. It includes like that conception of project-based learning where you're focused deeply on a subject, you get to know it really well, and in the process you're learning a lot of important critical thinking skills, research skills, all of these things that are going to be highly transferable beyond the particular subject that you are looking at. And it meets NGSS science practices pretty much inherently, that asking questions, defining problems, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data. All of these things are just really inherent in the inquiry process. And so it's helped meeting these practices that are really getting at the core of what it means to think scientifically. There are several different kinds of inquiry. If you're anything like me in your schooling, you might have experienced more of the confirmation type of inquiry, where the answer is already known. If you mix these two chemicals together, this is going to happen. And you're just kind of confirming that principle by doing the activity yourself. Structured inquiry is a little bit more open than that. So teacher presents a question and a method to investigate that question, but the answer is not known. Guided inquiry is a step beyond that. It's a teacher presented question, but the students design and select the methodology for examining that question. And then finally is open inquiry, which is probably the most authentic experience of science, where students are investigating their own questions and formulating their own methods for studying the answers. Sometimes, given your setting and your time constraints, that might not be something that you can do. You might be able to do something more of a guided inquiry where you present a question and allow the students to design procedures and think critically about how they would study that question. And so you can do any of these forms of inquiry in the classroom, but the further along the openness of the procedures, you invite more authenticity, more critical thinking, more investment from the students because they get to ask and answer their own questions. And so it can take the form of either observational or experimental studies. We do have a free resource called Investigating Evidence, which I believe one of our panelists will mention later, that scaffolds this whole process for you. And you can download that from our website. I'm going to ask Jackie to put a link in the chat window for us. And you'll notice that you can frame your questions in a way that is going to be an observational study or an experimental study, but many of the steps along the way of collecting your data, exploring and analyzing, those are all going to be very similar. It's just the setup of this experiment or the study might be different. So I wanted to share with you the SciGirls Strategies in conjunction with what I was talking about the STEM gap. SciGirls is a Twin Cities public television show that is meant to show women and girls doing science, experiencing scientific careers, things like that. Super fun show, and they've developed these really strong research-based strategies about how to engage girls in STEM. And what's great about these strategies is they don't only serve girls, they serve everybody. And as we go through and listen to our panelists, I have no doubt that you're going to pick up a lot of these strategies just kind of inherent in the inquiry process. Making things relevant to girls' lives by allowing them to investigate questions and solve problems that they've come up with themselves. That process of struggling and overcoming and rethinking your experiment or your study is really a big part of the inquiry process as well. So there's a lot that is incorporated and inherent in these sort of educational experiences that are of a real benefit to all sorts of students. So I'm going to hand over the presentation to Amy Alderman, who is an elementary teacher who's been doing some awesome work. And she's going to take over presenting. But Amy, just a quick reminder that I'll have to have control of the slides. So just say slide for me and I'll switch it on for you. And you may be muted, so you might have to unmute.
All right, is that it?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay. I started with the students when I first started all this process. I really was trying to get them to learn vocabulary. We were working on vocabulary because the kids were struggling with the names of animals. And then I realized I had a bigger problem. It wasn't just nature. We were afraid of everything in nature. We were afraid of butterflies and bugs and insects and birds. So I decided that I needed to start doing some things where I did observations of all the birds and other animals in our play area. But I also started recording the data for them, and I helped them do it. We researched to find out more information about birds, and then we started creating posters and drawings and movies to teach parents what we were learning. So this is some of those examples of the kids working on some activities. And if you'll switch the slide. After I retired, I lost my habitat. So I retired after teaching kindergartners for most of my life and moved to a school for children with special needs. So I had to learn about this new habitat. So I invited my friend to come help me collect some eBird samples. We went ahead and started collecting and figured out what kind of birds we already had. I joined the local Audubon group. And then I was so nervous about doing all this because when you're in a new place and you've been someplace for 20 years, it really was kind of scary. You'll change slides. I started to begin the different experiences, and I really started relying on what the kids were talking about at recess. And some of the first things we did were chipmunks. The kids love the chipmunks, so we started having some really good information learned about chipmunks, but it led us to lots of studies. And we would, draw the experience, and then we would record what we had. And then after spending several weeks of observing the nature and encouraging children to start out and start their little wandering process, we realized, okay, I'm going to start one little project that we could do, and that would be your guided inquiry, where I started the question and then we collected data as a group. Then we started working on letting the kids have some ownership. If you'll switch the slide. And basically what I did was we looked at what was around us. What did our habitat, what was happening there? As you can tell, we've done lots. We added like 200 truckloads of dirt to my new school. So that's a lot of dirt. But it led to the kids that we were curious about what they were doing and why they were doing it. And we watched the people bringing it back and forth, and, how much was it? Then we started asking questions. Well, we knew the animals in the front of the school were being disturbed. So we wanted to know if we could lure the crows, which are what we saw tons of in the very front and across the street, if we could possibly lure them to the back of the school. The students were at the same time doing their own writings, and they were using all the data that we had collected in their writings. Can you change the slide? Now, I will tell you, once the kids started their own campaigns and they started their own little inquiries, I must tell you, they became little advocates for whatever they thought we needed to work on. And one of the things they wanted to work on was, you can see the little balloon here. They were very, very concerned that people release balloons. Also, we were very, very fortunate. We have a college nearby. It's called Wesleyan. And it's about a mile from the school. So we go there like 3 or 4 times a year. So the kids really feel that that's their campus. So we actually made this sign, and and you press this little QR code, and it tells you why you should not feed our aquatic animals bread. So then they felt so strongly, they decided we were going to have a little youth festival. So we had the Macon Youth Birders Day. And basically what my children do is educate other people in the community about things we've learned about the birds. And they love it because it gives them a real voice, and they love having their parents come, and the parents get to see what all they've learned about. Now, I will tell you, this is actually, the letter at the bottom is actually the College of Wesleyan actually wrote us. And she was very impressed that our kids were so excited in doing citizen science. So it was a good opportunity for my kids to share, especially children with special needs. Often you're wanting them to have opportunities to use their voice and to, take a stand. And not just be told things. Can you switch slides? And you can see the experience has been incredible. It was amazing. The children came up with the first picture in the top left-hand corner that shows a ratio. We had, the kids wanted me to go buy a platform. So we bought a platform and we had a feeder, and we wanted to see what would happen. Well, the birds came to the feeder only once for every 10 times that they came to the platform. So it forced us to use ratios, and even though that was a 5th grade standard, my 2nd and 3rd and 4th graders were doing it, and they loved it. It also gave us opportunities to do graphing. So we've made tons of graphs, but they also learned how to use those in their writing. Can you turn to the next slide, please? Now, you'll ask me, so what's important about all that? Well, when children with special needs parents start calling you, and those parents have often had negative interactions with schools because their children have had trouble. When they start sending you posters and sending you signs when they've gone on vacation where they are learning about the things that we've been learning about in school, it's been incredible. One of these little boys, and it happens, I have several parents who've called me regularly, but this one in particular, the mama says, he sets up these experiments now all around our house and all around our yard. They're everywhere. And so he is also the child who at the end of school last year, he said, Miss Alderman, I think you should know, if you're going to spend money next year on your budget, you need to do these things. And he said, first of all, you need to get peanuts and then peanut butter, and then you need to have wild seeds. And if you have any extra money, then you can go for sunflower seeds. he put all that together from all the experiences we had last year. And those were mostly lots of questions that he had and the other students had generated. And I just went and bought the things that they asked me to buy that helped with our process. Can you flip to the next one? Now, I will tell you, one thing I have learned, don't do this alone. Find some partners. At the festival that we have, the kids have, I've tried to get somebody else to come and help. And that way it shares the load. But also, if you'll see here, this group of children, we're going to take a bunch of kids down to St. Simon's. The New York Times had this article about, we have a ship that overturned and they're trying to get the ship now broken up to lots of pieces. So the kids are going to be learning about that at school. We're going to be taking kids and we're going to be talking to people about shorebirds. And we're going to be having experiences with them. Our kids don't really know shorebirds very well because it's, you know, it's 4 hours to the beach. But we're going to learn about shorebirds in May. We're going to take the kids down Mother's Day weekend, and they'll have opportunities to share with other people about the things that we've been learning about. But also they'll set up some experiments while they're there, and we'll gather some data. Can you turn the next one? I think I have one more. Yep. So in case you were wondering if you can lure crows to the backyard, we did it. Georgia Peanuts, can you see down here? Georgia Peanuts did it. The kids were very excited because it's the first time we've ever had crows come within the playground and at our window. That was a very simple experiment. It didn't take long, but the kids really feel like they have ownership and they're so excited that they did it. They were successful. That's me for now.
Thank you so much, Amy. How cool that you successfully lured crows to where you wanted to see them on the other side of the building. And I love that quote you put in from the parent, how your student was all of a sudden doing science experiments everywhere. That's so cool. All right, next up, I'd like to invite Phil Kahler, who's a science and biology teacher, and this is his beautiful bird blind you're looking at, so I'm excited for you all to hear from him. Feel free to take it away.
All right, everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Excellent. All right, well, when I first started teaching at my school, I was very fortunate that I had a green space behind our school. And somehow I convinced my principal to letting us build a bird feeding station with a bird blind. And we used recycled lumber. I got lucky and had a contractor who was married to one of our staff, and he helped me put it together. And over a series of weekends, we had parents and students come out and help us build the feeding station. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Whoop, back. There we go. And so this is the outside of the bird blind and feeding station. Our students are on the path going in. So it's just a simple shelter where students can sit inside, rain or shine, and look out the opening at the feeders. And so, yeah, we built this in, I think it was 94, and we've been using it ever since. Next slide. And what's really cool about this is I wanted some way to get my students outside on a regular basis. And I knew field trips were expensive. And so the bird blind and feeding station allowed us to have lots of mini field trips at a whim whenever we wanted to. And so it gets the kids outside, and it's a way to get the kids in touch with nature through bird watching. We do a lot of, I help the kids learn to identify the birds, and that leads right into my unit on the scientific method, and they get to start conducting their own research. Next slide. And each of my students, I encourage them to open up their own eBird account. And so they can enter their eBird data, and they always get excited knowing that the data is not only used by them for their own reports, but also can be used by scientists around the world who do their own research. Next slide. And so as I help the kids learn to identify birds, they start learning how to count which species they see and how many of each species. Next slide. And so we've got a tally sheet that the students use, and I've listed most of the common species that show up at our feeders. We don't see every species every year, but they use this as a jumping off point, and there's room to write new birds if they show up. And so they just keep track of which birds they see when they, and they learn how to count them, being careful not to count them twice. But our tally sheet, I've also put a column there for weather data, and we have a weather bug station on the roof of our school. And so most of my students use weather as their independent variable, and then the bird data as their dependent variable. And we keep track of numbers of squirrels and chipmunks at the bottom as well. But this is our tally sheet, and I try to get my students out about a dozen times each school year so that they have a good set of data that they can work with. Next slide. And we've got a continuous data set all the way back to 1996 up till just last week in 2020. And you can see I was really interested when we started with the dark-eyed juncos compared to house sparrows. When we first started watching birds behind our school, we didn't have any house sparrows. They never showed up for the first 3 years. We never saw a single house sparrow. And juncos were by far the most numerous birds. They were very difficult to count when you've got the ground just crawling with juncos under the feeders. Numbers of up to 60 for a couple of years. That was a lot of birds. But then about 2000, all of a sudden, house sparrows showed up and juncos plummeted. And that was, the students between those 3 or 4 years, they really noticed the difference in what happened. And before we go to the next slide, though, if you look over time, both populations have kind of gone down and fluctuated a bit, but those initial years was huge. And next slide. And here's what happened. The black and white photo of our school grounds at the left. When I first started teaching here, we were rural. We had a filbert orchard across the street. We had quite a few wooded area, a fallow field behind the school, and so it was, it was countryside. But then in the color photo on the right, all of a sudden we had development. Across the street went a shopping center with stores and fast food, and then we had a lot of houses built both on where the orchard used to be and where the fallow farm field was behind the school. The green space that runs behind the school is a small stream that runs through there. And our bird feeding station's approximately where that yellow star is. But that development changed the landscape drastically, and the kids noticed what happened with that change of habitat in the bird population. So it's an interesting study. Next slide. And so one of my students, Christina, she wrote a paper about what happened. She researched how juncos and house sparrow populations were in other places in Oregon, and basically concluded that habitat change had something to do with the changes in the birds we were seeing. And her article, of course, was published in the predecessor to the Bird Sleuth Investigator. Next slide. Then a few years later, another student of mine decided to also research the effect of urban development on the house sparrow populations, and he got his paper published as well. And so I just love how my students are able to get their research published in the Bird Sleuth Investigator. And that's all part of this free curriculum that you can download. I think Jackie put the link there, the Investigating Evidence curriculum. And that'll walk you right through the process of getting your students to use their own data and then to write up their reports. Next slide. And this is just a continuous graph showing in the blue total numbers of birds and total numbers of species we've identified each year. First, for few years, I was not very good at identifying some of the species, but I got better at it. So our numbers kind of went up with the numbers of species. But I've been kind of interested in how it just seems like the numbers of just sheer numbers of total birds visiting seems to kind of looks like it's kind of going down. I really need to study it better. But it is interesting to look at, and I kind of try to model with my students my own questions, and then I encourage them to ask their own questions. And so they're able to use the data from our tally sheets that I showed you earlier to answer their own questions. A lot of them will ask questions about weather for their independent variable, but some of them will do other creative things as well. And so that is my last slide. So I think we're ready for Jeff.
Thank you so much, Phil. How awesome that your students have a long-term data set to look at. It's really neat. It allows them to ask some really cool questions. So I'd like to invite Jeff, if you want to go ahead and start your presentation for us. Jeff Manker is a retired high school teacher and a longtime friend of the program.
Hello. Yeah, I want to start off by saying I hope there's some other high school teachers out there. And despite how high school students often act on the outside towards, like, we're too cool for this and I can't get excited about anything because it would make me look foolish, kids take to birding. They love it. This is one of my classes from one of the last years I taught, and they became very enthusiastic birders. Almost every kid that goes through my class, I think, will become a birder the rest of their life. And so I want to encourage you to allow even high school kids to try this sort of thing. So, okay, next slide. Hello? There we go. So a lot of high school students feel like this about experimenting. They feel like they're in a cage, and it goes back to the confirmation inquiry or structured inquiry, where too many years students in many classes have been doing cookbook type experiments, and this makes them feel very constrained, and they also feel sort of like they're wasting their time. And by the time they get to high school, they felt like they've seen it all and done it all. However, next slide, please. I'd rather they felt like this, that they are free-range chickens. They can go out and investigate and find out things, and they will take away much more from their education if they have some freedom to try and sometimes even fail. They learn from that too, and that's okay as long as it's scaffolded with some support and help them find out that it's okay to not prove their hypothesis, and they can still learn something from that. Next slide, please. one of the easiest way to start is to, even with high school students, just let them ask questions about things they discover. One of the things I did in my ornithology class was every week we went out. Every Tuesday was birding day, and we'd go out and look around, and occasionally we'd find things. You can see in the picture on the left there were 2 hummingbird chicks on the ground beneath a pine tree. And the kids were upset, and oh my God, they fell out of the nest, and we have to do something. And I started by asking them, well, why? Why do we need to do something? And let's look at what's going on here. And you notice they're together, and maybe they left the nest on their own, or maybe we can find the nest, and so on. So we went through a whole question period. We also found a dead sharp-shinned hawk on another time, and you can see there the sharp shins of the sharp-shinned hawk. And of course they felt sad about it and everything, but it's a great way to start questions, to let them investigate and just say, why did it do this? Why is it like that? Well, look at this. Look at its feet. They're amazing. And look at the shins. That's why they're called sharp-shinned hawks. And, we talked about its features and its markings and so on. And kids had a real opportunity to discover things that just let them ask. And high school students don't get a lot of that opportunity. So I think it's really important to do that. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing is to get them outside. Like Phil, I also landed at a high school that had an open space very near us. These students are looking down into a creek. It's about 40 feet below them there. And we saw hooded mergansers, we saw wood ducks, we saw hawks, owls. We even had eagles fly over our campus, all kinds of great things. And when students are given the tools, like binoculars, and you can see they're carrying a bag there that has a field guide in it, a way to satisfy their curiosity, they become very curious. They're almost like third graders, running around there. It's amazing when they see something that they don't expect to see, their curiosity is reawakened. And it's really a great thing to see in high school kids. Next slide, please. One of the things I did, we talked about wing shape in my ornithology class, because different birds have different wing shapes. So I had them build paper airplanes with different wing shapes. You can see 2 in the air there, one with very long square wings and one with short triangular wings. And they had to try them out and see which one flew farthest, which one flew the curviest or the straightest. And so they're doing an experiment to see it. And they had fun. They had fun doing this, but it's a really simple experiment to test something and see what the results are, and then try to draw some conclusion from it. And then they compared them to actual birds that had wing shapes that were short or stubby or long and narrow and so on. So it's a chance for them to be kids, and that helps awaken their curiosity. Okay, next slide. Another thing that's important to do is to challenge them, to make them work for something. And in this activity, the kids I told them they had to go out and bring back 2 plastic or paper grocery bags full of natural materials, and they were going to have to build a nest that could hold a chicken egg. And that I was going to test it. I was going to shake it like a wind shaking a branch in a tree. And so, many of them wanted to use staple guns and glue and string. And I said, no, it has to be all natural materials. And I said, you have a great advantage because you have 2 hands, not just a beak. And so this is their process of doing it. So you can see the next slide, please. You can see they worked really hard to build this. They all started with a Y-shaped stick that they could attach it to, but they used grasses and vines and things like that to tie things. And then they had to fill in the bottom so the egg didn't fall through. So they had to build a steady platform and so on. Next slide. And I also told them it had to be beautiful. So it brought out the artist in them. Some of them put flowers. They had little tassels hanging off, all kinds of stuff. And this is one of the finished products. And at the end, they're very proud when their nest works and holds and looks good. And all their friends gather around when I do the shake test over a trash can. And it's really a great experience for them to be challenged to try something. Okay, next slide. Which brings me to investigating evidence. I told you earlier that many kids are used to doing structured inquiry. And investigating evidence is a scaffold for open inquiry. In other words, it gives them all the stages to go through and lots of very clear instructions of how to do it, like how to come up with a hypothesis, how to do a graph, how to collect data, and so on. But it doesn't tell them what the experiment should be. And that's the thing I love about this curriculum is I used it every year, and every year kids came up with different experiments. And it's often has to do with a feeder, but it gives them the opportunity to try their own thing. And but it gives them a framework to do it in, because one of the other things about high school students is they're very afraid of failure in front of their peers. That's one of the things that as kids get older, they become more and more fearful of standing out in some way, and especially in failure. And so I wanted them to be successful, and this is the perfect way to do it. Is it gives them all the stages to go through. It gives them a chance to bounce ideas off their teacher or their peers about, is this going to really work? Can I really do this? And in the end, they've got even if it wasn't scientifically super rigorous, they still can complete it and have all the pieces, and it looks good, and they feel some accomplishment in having figured something out about the natural world. And I really strongly suggest doing this. Next slide. This is a group I'm working with now that I'm retired. This is a group of high school students from a local high school, and they're doing a year-long project that's sponsored by the Monterey Bay Aquarium near where I live. And they get almost the exact same thing from investigating evidence only over a year. And they do this long monitoring project at a local lagoon, and they're going to publish a scientific poster, and they're going to present it at the Moss Landing Marine Lab, which is a scientific institution near us. And they're proud of what they're doing. They feel really good about it. You can see it in their faces here, and they're birders, and they love it. So I would strongly suggest doing open inquiry with your students. And if you need the scaffolding, definitely use investigating evidence. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. Just really awesome to hear about reigniting that curiosity like you talked about in your high school students by allowing them just to be silly and wander and discover. So that's really cool. Also,
thank you.
His kitty sweater is pretty excellent. So
Okay.
thank you so much, Jeff. And now we're going
You're
to
welcome.
hand it over to our friend Kathy Rigling, who is a retired middle school teacher who now teaches at Wekiva Youth Camp as the nature coordinator there.
Good evening, everybody. So we're going to leave out with middle school. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So next slide, please. So as I was a middle school science teacher, I was always looking for opportunities, like the others have said, to get my kids outside, to get them connected with nature, because so many of them, especially middle school kids, they're inside a lot and they're too connected to their technology. So at the school I was previously, for several years, I had the benefit of having a portable that had a beautiful backyard area with trees. And I did Project Feeder Watch, which is a great project that you could try with your whole class. It's very low cost, but we did that. So I, at one point, got moved, and I was like, I've lost my feeding area and everything. So I found out that there was like an area in between my portable and the others that was a grassy area. So I asked my principal, hey, can we make a garden there? Can we make a bird and butterfly habitat? And so we were allowed to. So go ahead and do the next slide. And I had a nature club. And so that's when we got to work, and I did some, I got some people to help me, and we got donations. We even had someone local that grew native plants that gave us cuttings, and we had couple of work days. The first work day was like super rainy, but the kids stayed and they got all muddy, and it was memorable. And it was really incredible. You know, we're lucky in Florida. We have a great climate, and the garden took off pretty well. And what was really nice is I had these nice windows. So I guess my portable was like a blind, a bird blind. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I went ahead and in the meantime, you know, we have to teach the strands of nature or science. And I also use the investigating evidence curriculum. It's great. You can adapt it to whatever you teach. And part of it in there is where there's some short little biographies of different kinds of scientists that aren't the traditional kind of scientists. And so here in Florida, we do a lot of, you know, reading in the content. So I had them in groups. Each group had a different scientist. They made a presentation poster about, as you can see, what was the scientist's question, what data did they collect, what did they learn? And that kind of, as they presented that to each other, they saw that, hey, scientists don't all work in a lab, and they have all different kinds of questions that they're investigating. You can go to the next slide. So at this point, I'm trying to scaffold them in learning to ask their own questions. And as you can see, the garden took off. Now, this was probably the next year. It didn't happen that quick. But I said, this is a perfect opportunity, because in the past, I tried having students do nature journals. And with middle schoolers, doing stuff at home doesn't always happen, especially going outside. You know, some parents didn't want to let them out. So anyways, we had our perfect opportunity. So they would have a prompt each week in their journal, and I scaffolded it in the beginning. It was very content related to what we were doing. Then I tried to open it up more, and I could watch them, or we could go out as a whole class. It just depended. Sometimes when we were working on something, I'd send a couple of students out and let them go make observations and then write questions. And it just really lent itself to a really neat opportunity. And it got them really paying attention to nature, and they would notice a lot more things and talk to me about things they saw at home. That was great. Okay, next slide. I made a little station in my classroom where we kept eBird data, and of course we were doing Project Feeder Watch, which runs from November to April. And what's really neat about Project Feeder Watch, it can generate your own graphs, and you go back all the way to where I started, and I could compare my original site with that site. And it did take a while for the birds to find it, because we were more in the middle of the campus, but the birds did find it. It was really exciting. And you know, those teachable moments, I'd be teaching something else and birds would come in, and you know, we'd stop and talk about it, and that was okay, because that's all part of inquiry. You can go to the next slide, please. And of course, this led to bird-related investigations of the students, and we could expand it from there. As you heard a lot of others talking about how getting them to ask the question just opened up lots and lots of doors to authentic investigation, stuff that they were interested in, they were curious about. It was a lot more meaningful than cookbook science. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So currently, I'm retired. I do substitute teach, and it's opened my eyes to seeing there's a lot of classrooms where they're still teaching, this is the 6 steps of the scientific method. So I'm like, but we're working on it. But at summer camp, the kids were hiking, and as you can see on the right, actually that was going through after prescribed burn, which we do a lot of in Florida, and they keep nature journals. Of course, it's a lot less informal than in school, but the kids are encouraged to write about what they see and draw pictures. And I do a wonder board where the kids can write questions, and we can try during the course of the week have them, you know, discuss. We can't always do an investigation, but you get them curious and wanting to know more. And a lot of the kids come back from year to year, so you can kind of build on what we're doing, and hopefully, you know, get them excited to lifelong learning of science. And you go to the next slide. And we also do there's a lot of other resources from Cornell, such as this migration challenge game. This year we're studying birds, and it's a great tool. And we have this game where the kids just by playing the game, learn about all the challenges birds face in migration, and that leads to questions that hopefully maybe when they go home or when they go to school, they will maybe investigate more, but at least we open their eyes up to some of these things. And I think that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kathy. This is it's just really wonderful to see all the different approaches to inquiry and how cool that you were able to create a garden space that drew in birds and allowed you to do Project Feeder Watch. 14 mourning doves at once, I noticed. That's quite a few mourning doves.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. So now I would like to open it up to everyone in the audience to ask questions of our panelists. And while you're thinking of some questions, I did have one question for you guys that I'm always curious about, is what is one thing that you wish someone had told you before you started doing inquiry with your students? And feel free to just unmute yourself and.
I think that it's okay for it to last, even if it lasts 2 or 3 weeks. And, you know, you may have to have a little corner that's a slightly messier where the kids are doing the collecting. That's okay. Because, you know, sometimes people get where they think everything has to be finished within a class period. It's not. It's just not.
Inquiry is a time investment.
I totally agree with Kathy. It is a time investment, and it's not just a one and done type of thing. We continue ours almost like we started with Project Feeder Watch also. So we kind of got into that routine of starting our data collection in November, and we don't write our reports until February, and we're right in the middle of that now. But one thing I wish I would have known, I guess I wish I would have been encouraged to do inquiry sooner, or I started out right away, but don't wait. You can start small and it'll grow.
Yeah, I'll back up that. I wish I'd done more now that I'm retired, that, you know, it's so valuable because it's authentic and it's really meaningful to the kids when they come up with it themselves and they see real the nature happening around. It's not always what we expect. And that it meant a lot to them that their data was going to the scientists. And one little interjection, we would always do the Great Backyard Bird Count, which just ended yesterday. Yeah. And I always would have the kids, like we'd go out in the morning. I had a bird club, you know, we'd go out like every other week. And when we went out and we came in and we entered our data, I'd have up on the smartboard the map from Great Backyard Bird Count, and the kids could watch when our data went in. They were so excited. That was like real to them then.
Wonderful.
I would say that not to be intimidated by the word inquiry, that it's just asking questions, and it doesn't have to be complicated and long and involved. It can be a simple thing, and in fact, that may be the easiest way to get started, is to start with, what's that bird out there? That's an inquiry where, you know, you start using resources to answer the question, and eventually, you know, they become more comfortable with that kind of inquiry. Then you can add more steps, like what is that bird doing, and why is it doing it, and how can we prove it's doing this thing, or whatever. So it's good to start small and then build your way up.
Great. So a couple of you mentioned time, and that inquiry takes a longer time to do, and that it's okay that it takes a long time to do. I'm wondering if there's a part of the process that you find takes the most time or the most planning to have go well.
I would say it depends on what you're studying. When my students invented, or, you know, came up with an experiment or a question to try and answer, some of them could be done with only a few observations, but others took weeks. And, you know, it's okay to get the inquiry started and let them begin on their thing, and then set a time period, 6 weeks or whatever. This is when we're going to start finish with the data collection, and then do the write-up and figure out what our answer was. But you can do other things simultaneously. Once you get it set up and running, they can do their observations for a few minutes each day or once a week or whatever it is, and then you can teach the rest of your class doing something else. So it doesn't have to be the whole class, is what I guess I'm trying to say.
Gotcha. Awesome.
I do think you need to go back and let the kids, with my children, because it takes them sometimes longer to process things. Sometimes I need to reflect on it over 4 or 5 days. So I may bring it up again just in when we're sitting around waiting for somebody, or we've got just a few minutes between class. So I keep coming back to the topic, because it's amazing after the 3rd or 4th time they really can, like, the words are theirs, and they can also describe what happened and use better terminology and more complex ideas the more they've talked about it and the longer they've talked about it.
Mm-hmm. So that reflection time is an important piece.
Yes.
To really absorb. Very cool. So how do you go about guiding students to a testable question? Because I'm assuming that sometimes students come up with things that in your time frame or your setting that you can't really investigate.
I spend quite a bit of time with my students. After we've been out to our feeding station a few times, I have them come up with 3 questions, and then we rework it and we work the problem. But if it's something they could easily just Google, I usually send them back to the drawing board. Come up with something and then sometimes they'll also ask just way out questions. We're not even collecting that data. And so I say, look at our tally sheet. Can it be answered with the data that we have on our tally sheet?
So it helps you to have that data set as a framework for them to ask questions within to kind of rein it in. That's neat. So
Sometimes,
sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, often I would give the students a little bit of time to try and come up with a question, and I would warn them ahead of time that, make sure this is something you can really test. But later I would, before they went too far down that road, I would try to interview each of the students or the groups and ask them, what's your testable question? And then I'd find out, oh, they need a laser and, a jet aircraft or something.
Exactly.
No, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to figure out something else. So having one-on-one conversations with them is helpful before they go too far down the road.
Agreed.
So one-on-one conversations can help make sure you don't need to get a jet engine. Good.
That's right. That's right.
So we are a little bit over time, but I would like to just kind of wrap up with asking you, what do you find to be the most challenging and the most rewarding parts of doing inquiry?
The most challenging part is fitting it in with all the other requirements that public school teachers are normally required to teach, and making sure that your administration understands that this is the process of science, and that they may walk in and you're talking about birds because that's what your kids are investigating, but it's really the nature of science is what the kids are learning. So to me, that was the most challenging, and but it's very rewarding when the kids are doing authentic stuff.
So thank you.
Something I find really rewarding too is often you won't see it in the classroom because it's not cool to admit that you like birds. But I'll hear it sometimes years later. I'll have a former student, you know, come up to me and just say, Mr. Kahler, I saw such and such a bird, and I can't figure out why I even know that, you know, and they're pointing out, you know, I'll have a parent come by and say, you know, Johnny was pointing out all the birds on last summer's camping trip, you know, and that just makes me happy.
That's awesome. Open their eyes to the world of birds.
Yeah.
And I've even had grandparents call me and say, I appreciate how much time you're taking to learn this because it's made him or her more patient. So,
yeah, what a wonderful side benefit. I think that's something that by slowing down and observing nature, we all can develop in ourselves, is that quietude and that patience and that connection. That's awesome. Wow. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It is just after 7:05, so if you do need to leave, we totally understand. I'll be hanging out for a few minutes, and panelists, if you can, you're welcome to stay. If you have a commitment, please feel free to head on out. But I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and your experiences. We can talk about inquiry all we want here, but it's so much more powerful to hear what it's like for you guys on the ground and what your experience has been doing these things with the different age groups and settings that you work in. So thank you all so much. If our attendees, if you are looking to receive credit for these webinars, you can send us an email for one contact hour completion letter at k12lab@cornell.edu, and we can set you up with that. Otherwise, this webinar has been recorded, and probably this version will go live on Friday on our YouTube channel. Send out a link to everybody, and you'll be able to check back in on the stories and the ideas that you heard here tonight. All right. Thank you, Raphael. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. Jackie, I just got my chat window open, but if we missed any questions, please feel free to flag them for us.